What happened to cause that plane not to arrive at its originally scheduled destination, Beijing? Something happened to cause that plane not to make it there. What was that? That's question one. Question two is, where did MH370 end its flight?
Yeah.
Where does that plane, whether in whole or wreckage, where did it land or where did it crash? Lane Gibson, the self-proclaimed Indiana Jones, 80% of the wreckage recovered that's attributed to Malaysian Flight 370 was found by this single man. Do you find him credible, and do you think that his discovery of the evidence was legitimate? There's a very specific protocol that's supposed to be followed by the pilot, and he was told who to contact, the frequency to contact. He never did it, and 90 seconds from that handoff, the plane went dark and was never really confirmed to have been seen again. Do you think that's as significant a piece as I do right there, that it was that little window where this pass-off was happening? And really, I mean, it's the responsibility of no one but the pilot to do that all of a sudden this happened?
It was a total coincidence that the plane went dark, so to speak, at that time, or there was some intentional act. The reason I think it's very significant, in addition to that, is that, like everything else on any commercial aircraft, there's a great deal of redundancy. And everything from inside that plane that allows us to communicate went away, all at the same time. I've got to say, Bill, nothing in the entire documentary affected me as much as this one initial piece of evidence.
Chief Mark Garrett, you got your pilot headphones on, so you're ready for this episode today.
Oh, boy. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Good to see you. We're going to talk today about Malaysian Air Flight 370. This is back in, hey, it's hard to believe, Mark, it's been more than 10 years, right?
You know what? When we started researching this, Bill, I thought, God, a decade already? Time flies. Yeah. No pun intended.
Yeah. And, a little bit different. It's interesting talking about it today. We have a little more information about Boeing, right? This was a Boeing plane, 777. Kind of, I don't know if that comes into your mindset or what you think may have happened or whatever. Just to remind everybody, this was March 8th, 2014. Flight took off from Kuala Lumpur, bound for Beijing. 227 passengers and 12 crew? 239 people total. Never arrived in Beijing. And hey, Mark, when we do a show like this, I like to pretend I'm a storyteller, right? And go through the chronology of events and then rely on you for the wisdom and, interesting opinions as to what may or may not have happened. But I think to set the stage for this one, first, the two questions, because as we both watched a documentary, and it was called MH370, the plane that disappeared, released last May 2023, I think. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, it was last month. Yeah.
So, or last month. I think it was 2023.
Yeah, it was. I'm sorry. Yes, last year.
So I've always kind of thought about this incident as kind of like one mystery, but reality is maybe we should think about it as two mysteries. And by the end of this show, or at the end of this show, I'm going to give my opinion on very specifically what I think happened and ask you to do the same thing. But here are the two questions. The two questions are, what happened to cause that plane not to arrive at its originally scheduled destination, Beijing? Something happened to cause that plane not to make it there. What was that? That's question one. Question two is, where did MH370 end its flight?
Yeah.
Where does that plane, whether in whole or wreckage, where did it land or where did it crash? Where did it end its flight? Those are the two questions that we're going to attack today. And I think in order to answer those questions, you have to decide, as we go through and tell this story, the listeners have to decide how they feel about a few key pieces of evidence. And rather than kind of wait till we bring these pieces of evidence up during the storytelling, so to speak, I want to kind of put them out there out front, at least from my point of view. And then then see if I missed anything, if you think there's any other key pieces. But I'm going to kind of list what I think are probably the three key pieces of evidence that will call how you feel about these three key pieces of evidence, or whether you find them credible. In my opinion, that will determine what you think happened and where that flight ended. So the first key piece of evidence that I saw in this was the Inmar, and again, we're not going to really get in the weeds as to what this evidence is now. I'm just putting it out there so people, as we talk about it, they kind of key on it and listen closely to these particular parts. The first one is the Inmarsat data that tracked the plane after it was lost from radar, or after both lost from radar and the transponder stopped functioning, was powered down.
Mm-hmm.
The second one, and this may be my favorite, Mark, I can't wait to talk to you about this one. Lane Gibson, the self-proclaimed Indiana Jones. I think the number I heard was 80% of the wreckage recovered that's attributed to Malaysian Flight 370 was found by this single man. Do you find him credible, and do you think that, you know, his discovery of the evidence was legitimate? And again, how you feel about that's really going to play a big role in what you think happened and where that plane lies. And the final one that I had, Mark, was the flight simulator data extracted from the pilot's home computer by the FBI. Yeah, the FBI is involved in many of these stories that we tell, Mark, aren't they?
Yeah.
We'll just
Not
see.
always in a good way.
No, sometimes,
as far as I'm concerned.
Sometimes in a good way, but yeah, it seems like
Sometimes.
often not. Often not. So I don't know, any other key pieces of evidence, Mark, that you feel in your mind, really how someone feels about that piece of evidence would cause them to form a particular opinion?
Well, those are the three important broad topics. You know, the pieces of evidence are, you know, a lot more minute. We can get into those, but I think you touched on the three general topics that we should look at.
Right.
Yeah.
So 3 episodes, each one generally about an hour long, I think. The first one, and really this documentary, again, the name of it is MH370, the plane that disappeared. It kind of proposes or puts out there 3 different potential theories as to what may have happened to this plane, to this flight. In episode 1, the name of the episode is The Pilot. So you can kind of imagine what the theory put forth here is. But this is where we get into a little bit of the storytelling and reminding everyone what exactly happened here. Flight took off. It was March 8th, 12:41 a.m. As I said, took off from Kuala Lumpur, bound for Beijing. And as it was leaving Kuala Lumpur Air Traffic Control's area of responsibility, then I guess how it works is there's a pass-off, basically. You know, you make radio contact with the jurisdiction, so to speak, you're leaving. They tell you where to contact the jurisdiction you are entering. And you do that, and kind of tracking of you and guidance of your flight is then passed off to that new jurisdiction. So at 1:20 a.m., there was this handoff from KLA airspace to Vietnam airspace, and that's where the plane vanished. There was never a check-in with Vietnam, and all of a sudden, the transponder was lost. It was about 90 seconds, I think, after that last radio contact. And to me, this is a big deal, that it was in this gray zone where, you know, there's very specific protocol that's supposed to be followed by the pilot. And he was told who to contact, the frequency to contact. He never did it. And 90 seconds from that handoff, the plane went dark and was never really confirmed to have been seen again. You know, I guess by that, I just mean no more transponder information. No more beacon. Do you think that's as significant a piece as I do right there, that it was that little window where this pass-off was happening? And really, I mean, it's the responsibility of no one but the pilot to do that all of a sudden this happened?
Yeah, I think that's very significant. And, you know, I wanted to obviously watch all 3 episodes and get as much information as I could before I came to whatever conclusions that I may have come to. But that was very, very significant, because you have to think of, look, there's 1 or 2 ways to go here. It was a total coincidence that the plane went dark, so to speak, at that time, or there was some intentional act. And the reason I think it's very significant, in addition to that, is that, like everything else on any commercial aircraft, there's a great deal of redundancy, and everything from inside that plane that allows us to communicate went away all at the same time. That's still, even having watched the entire episode, nothing really in the entire thing, I've got to say, Bill, nothing in the entire documentary affected me as much as this one initial piece of evidence.
That's interesting to hear you say that, because I feel the exact same way. The exact same way. And hey, I to be honest, as I watched this documentary, and this is probably the intended effect, it's made for entertainment, I would say, oh, that's what happened. And then 15 minutes later, no, wait a minute. No, maybe this is actually what happened in this. But each time, Mark, I kept coming back to that one incident and saying, but how is this a coincidence? How is this a coincidence that at this moment in time, when it's the pilot's responsibility to do the handoff, and basically no one's, I don't know if the way to put it is, the receiving air traffic control centers not really looking for you until you check in with them, and the transponder goes off, there's never a check-in, the plane goes dark right at that moment when it's in that, quote, gray zone. That, for me, turned out to be something that was really tough to, I guess, to overcome, the importance of just the timing of that incident. So, and by the way, this is in the South China Sea. I get a little, geography is not my strong point, right? South China Sea. So the plane's reported missing at this point. And I don't know exactly how long it took, but I mean, you would think relatively quickly someone would have noticed that the transponder, they lost the beacon, whatever, they don't see it. They don't see it anymore on tracking systems. And, later find out, or within a couple hours found out that there's a couple interesting bits of information that seem to suggest something happened to the plane in the South China Sea. A guy in an oil rig reports seeing a plane on fire, right? If you remember that. And then they did identify oil slicks found in the South China Sea. And the one thing that I thought was interesting is there was Cathay Pacific pilots. I don't know if it was two pilots in one plane, captain and co-pilot, or two separate aircraft that reported seeing, and the quote I got is, large solid debris in the water. So when you see that, you think, man, the plane, someone saw it on fire, there's an oil slick, and someone saw debris in the water. That's tragic. That plane must have went down. But as they investigated that, I guess they took some of the oil slick and had it analyzed, and it turned out not to be jet fuel. It was oil from, what would be called? Like shipping. Yeah, shipping.
They did a chemical analysis of it and determined right away that it was not aviation fuel.
There you go. No real way to refute what a guy in an oil rig reported that he saw, right? Plane on fire, who knows? And then the debris, I mean, we can get into that a little later, I guess, with that Tom Nod stuff and the woman who felt she had seen debris in the South China Sea. But one interesting thing was there was a plane, and if I have this correct, there was a plane flying a similar route that was like 30 minutes ahead of them that reached out for them on an emergency channel. And I'm assuming, although it didn't really make this clear, Mark, I don't know if you have the same thought that I do. I'm assuming they did this after the plane was lost on the tracking systems. They probably put out some kind of broadcast and, just like you would do if there was a police officer, missing, right? A police officer on patrol missing, right? And another plane tried to contact them and reported hearing a lot of static and mumbling. I don't know what to make of that. You have any thought on that piece right there?
I don't either. That was very confusing to me. It wasn't the only thing confusing in the documentary, which is understandable because it's an unsolved mystery. I mean, it's a mystery. But if this other airliner heard the static and mumbling, then that would indicate that the plane had not gone dark from all communication. In other words, this is a contradiction to me. If another plane can pick up something, then certainly radar and radio communications could do the same thing. So I don't have any conclusion about that other than it's contradictory to me.
Yeah. Yeah. The only thing that I thought, I don't know, I mean, I don't know if there's really any, this is, speculation, but when you hear mumbling and also thinking about Boeing, I think cabin depressurization, lack of oxygen, incoherence, or somebody was drugged, or somebody was, there was some kind of physical assault. I mean, all these things, I guess, are possible. We just don't
Mhm.
know. But that's the only three things I thought of when I heard of mumbling and static. Struggle,
Mhm.
lack of oxygen, or some kind of like drugging scenario. And there's really nothing, no answer to that. We never really get any more information about that. Another thing that was, it's a very small thing, but when I guess the families gathered, right? The families of passengers and crew gathered, was it at a hotel in Beijing where the plane was destined for? I think,
Yeah.
I think. And
Yeah, the
one
vast
of the,
majority of the family would the vast majority, of course, were Chinese citizens on this plane. Not all, but the majority.
yeah, did you catch that where someone said that, it was kind of a third party thing. Someone reported that someone else in the group had received a call on their phone, and they
Yes.
said they held up the phone or something and said, oh, my dad's calling from the plane. What should I do? What should I do? And they said, answer it. And then when the person answered it, there was no one there.
Yeah, if I remember, Bill, there was more than one of those. I can't remember if it was both in the first episode, but I believe there were two different claims that someone had called. Now, it's very bizarre because if you're wondering where your loved one is, on this flight, and then you are receiving a call from them on your cell phone, the idea that you would hold your phone up to show anybody else rather than immediately answer that call,
Yeah.
that's what hit me. And saying, that's not how I would react. I don't know anybody who would waste 1 millisecond showing anybody else. I wouldn't even show my wife that my loved one was calling. I mean, I'd answer the phone immediately
Right.
because we'd be so desperate for any communication. Yeah, I wouldn't waste 1 millisecond with that. So I didn't know really how to digest that other than I don't want to say I don't buy it, but it was very, very suspicious.
Yeah, that's a weird one. You make a great point there. Like, who would do that? That doesn't really make a lot of sense. The only other part of cell phone thing I heard mentioned was they seem to make an issue or make it a point to say that when people called loved ones on the plane, it didn't the calls did not go straight to voicemail. There was an audible ringing of the phone. You know what I mean? Whereas if you
Yes.
had your phone turned off, or I guess they're insinuating that if the phone was out of
Dead.
service somewhere, right,
Hmm.
that it would have gone straight to voicemail.
Right.
I don't know, man. I
Yeah.
don't know, because somebody would find some way to answer the phone, you would think, if they could, you know?
Now, and to that point, what what wasn't covered in this that I remember, and maybe you can correct me. In other words, to that point, would not the cell phone providers, the companies, be engaged in this as well? Yes, we know we're getting pings from
Yeah.
these phones, or we got pings from these phones. I never heard anything along those lines about what AT&T or whatever whatever Chinese carrier or anybody. I never got any information about cell phone carriers and location data, and as far as activity of the phone. Maybe that's part of the investigation that was not in the documentary, but that was interesting to me that it was omitted.
Yeah, and that had to have been part of the investigation. It's such a basic thing, and I just have to think that it didn't really, I don't want to say fit the narrative, but I just that it really didn't lead to the development of any information. So,
Mhm.
yeah. So I guess as the morning went by, they found no wreckage in the South China Sea, even though it was reported, which that's kind of weird, right? I mean, Cathay Pacific pilots report seeing stuff, and then they go look and they don't see anything. I don't know what to make of that.
Right.
So the search at that time, right, was originally focused in the South China Sea, like the direct line, the flight path that this plane would have went on. And then all of a sudden in the morning, the following morning, or as daylight came, I guess, word comes that military radar tracked the plane and it changed course after the transponders went dark, and it flew back over the Malaysian peninsula, right? Now, here's the issue. There's no way to really, you can verify that a plane did that, but from what I understand, there's no way to really even confirm the size of the plane. And because there's no transponder, the plane's not sending out a signal saying, this is who I am. So all they know is that a plane flew this route. They could have been, the one aviation expert said it really could have even been a helicopter. Like there's no way that you can determine the type of plane it is just from a radar ping, which I would have thought it was a little more advanced than that. Were you surprised by that?
You know what? I kind of wondered. I don't know what the technology is. I don't know if U.S. military radar can ascertain what type of plane, and an object may be, or if it's just a general size. I just plead ignorance to it. I was a little surprised, but my surprise is based again on ignorance.
Yeah.
I thought they could identify the plane. In other words, the kind of the type of the plane. Is it a B-52 bomber, or is it a small fighter plane, things like that. But so I was surprised, but to me, again, it didn't determine, the outcome of the investigation,
Right.
or raise any red flags with me, let's put it that way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, you would think there would be some technology that would be able to determine if it was hostile. If you're on a military base, the
Yeah.
technology would exist, I would think, that could determine if it's a hostile plane, whatever. But maybe they rely a lot on transponders of friendly planes. I don't know. Um, kind of a tangent here, Mark. The one thing that I thought was interesting at this part was, and I want to hit you on critical incident experience, right? It seemed like, or when you, well, let me ask you this, and I have my own experience in this. A critical incident happens. How accurate are first reports in your experience when you hear about a critical incident? The very first reports that you get.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. The answer is it depends. It depends on how long after the incident occurred that the initial reports take place. The reason is because the longer that you wait, the more information you are able to obtain and digest and to verify. And so often when we have very very early initial press conferences and things like this, you're right, they can be very, very inaccurate. And that's why it's very important when you give the very timely, response to the media or address of the media, things like this, that you're very general with it. And you admit that hey, listen, we don't know what we don't know at this time. So, that's kind of, one-on-one when it comes to media relations and public relations, public response with these types of incidents. Now, the thing is, something like this, it doesn't get very often very much more critical or more impactful, more newsworthy than an event like this. So you want to get some information out there as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
But you have to be very, very cautious, because if you really internally don't have any idea on God's green earth as to what happened, you have to be very, very clear about that from the first moment, or what happens, you lose credibility. And so now you start creating an environment of frustration and anger, and understandably, with the situation. So that's kind of critical incident, 101 when it comes to media and public relations.
Yep. And Mark, that's exactly the piece I was looking for there. I mean, when that's exactly what happened. I mean, I felt like, or the impacted people who were waiting for their loved ones felt like the story kept changing, and it became a situation where there was a lack of trust or a perception of incompetence. And it's exactly what you just said. And that's been the same experience I've had in critical incidents. You got to be very careful in, rushing to put something out when you don't really know immediately after an event what happened, because as the narrative changes and as you get more information and as you refine what probably actually did take place, all of a sudden people are like, well, that's not what you said originally. Like, are you trying to hide something? What's going on? And the reality is, you probably just spoke and said something you shouldn't have early on because there was a rush to put out information, whether it was pressure from government, pressure from airline executives, whatever. I've been there in critical incidents with people pressuring me to report, and you got to be careful. You have to push back a little bit and say, hey, let us get the correct information before we start putting out something that turns out to be incorrect. And then it's out there forever, you know?
It's out there forever.
Yep. So this was an interesting one because internet sleuthing, I would call it, started at this point, where all these kind of groups formed. One of them was called the Independent Group, and that was just a group of aviation experts. I think what was it, on Facebook originally or something, Mark, maybe?
I believe it was, yeah, it was one of the social media platforms. They all got together. I think some of the people, in other words, they were very well acquainted previously, and then they attracted or recruited other people in the industry.
Right. And, you know, I guess social media allowed for like the real-time citizenry investigation, if that's the way to put it, where everyone kind of brought their different expertise to the table and started putting forth these theories. The other part of that was the Tom Nodders. I had never heard of this. Tom Nod, TOMNOD. And
Makes two of us.
they were reviewing pictures of the ocean looking for wreckage, right?
Mhm.
Now, I don't
Yes.
know like where they were getting these pictures. That's the question. Like,
That's
how,
yep.
you know, and hey, I have some experience with NGA, the National Geospatial, I think it's National Geospatial Agency. Anthony, maybe check me on that. I know it's called NGA. That's the abbreviation. My time at DEA, when I worked at a place called the Special Operations Division, we had occasion to get some imagery from them. And the one thing that I took away from that experience when I was there is I remember one time looking at these satellite images, and there was a pretty detailed description of what was in the image. And Mark, I looked at this image, and to my untrained eye, it was like, you see what here? So I bring this up just to say, when you're looking at that imagery, there's a real expertise it takes. You know, I don't forget what they're like, photo analyst. I don't know. It's whatever their job title is. Photo interpretation, man, there's a real expertise there that this one particular woman said she was a photographer and had a good eye. And again, how
Yeah.
timely are these? I guess what I'm saying is I don't know where you get access to real-time satellite imagery other than from some government entity. Am I missing something?
No, I thought the same way. There were a lot of questions there. There were
Yeah.
a lot of questions there. And the woman who said that she has, photography background and things like this, and this is why she has a trained eye that you're talking about. And maybe I'm missing something, Bill, but I was really never satisfied as to exactly where that image came from or images that she was referring to. I watched it like you did,
Mhm.
wasn't really sure about that. And I really wasn't sure never was it made clear as to, in other words, was it verified what that quote unquote debris was? In other words, was there anybody else in the world, a fishing vessel, airlines, military? Did anybody else ever verify that debris? And if I'm not missing something, I don't think that ever happened.
Yeah, the answer seems to have been no. The answer seems to have been no. And, she said she compared it with schematics of the plane, and, they kind of showed like a schematic of the plane, and then they would
Mhm.
show these things in the water. And I don't know, like I said, I didn't make the conclusions that she did, but again, she put it out, on all her Facebook groups and whatever. I found evidence. And even listening to her, she says no one really ever responded to her, or almost like no, like you said, almost like no one even really ever asked her like where specifically that was. So I don't
Mhm.
know. It just seemed like a lead that didn't lead to anything, a dead lead.
Yes.
I guess the next kind of significant thing is Inmarsat data.
Mhm.
And this is going to be, with my education level, this might be a tough one to explain, Mark. But here's what I took away from that. The transponder on the plane was turned off at one point. It was lost on radar at one point when it went, it was the military radar station said it turned around, flew back over the Malaysian peninsula, and then was lost on radar at some point. Here's how planes communicate, right? When they communicate, they don't communicate from the air down to the ground. They communicate from the air up to a satellite, and then from that satellite station back down to the ground. So Inmarsat, the company responsible for the satellite and for this communication network, they decided to jump in and see if they could help determine what happened or locate the plane. And what happens is, as the plane is flying, wherever it is, just like when you, I guess an analogy would be just like when you drive around with your cell phone, even if you're not making a telephone call, Mark, occasionally your phone will reach out to the nearest cell tower and basically establish its whereabouts. It'll say, here I am. If there's any traffic for me, I just want to let you know I am here. And this happens, every time you're kind of bouncing to a new cell tower or whatever. In the case of Inmarsat, it's similar, but I think it's specifically, it was every hour or something like that. Every predetermined period of time, the satellite would send a signal to the plane, and just to verify that the plane was there, so to speak, that the equipment was on and functioning, and that signal would bounce back to the satellite. So they said that, I think, after the plane was lost on radar, there were 7 or 8 pings that were successfully received by the satellite, meaning that the plane was still in the air. Is that explanation working, Mark? Yeah.
Yeah. You summarized it,
Okay.
just fine.
Yeah. So, and it means some specific things here, which, and this got a little in the weeds. I even had to dig into something outside the documentary, Mark, because I was so curious about this Inmarsat information. Here's a quote from this other piece I found. The data link between the aircraft and the satellite telecommunications network was lost at some point between 107 and 203. So they don't know exactly when, because again, it's not pinging the plane every second. They just know that they missed a ping that was somewhere that was in that time period. Like there was one ping at 107 that went through. There was another one at 203 went through, but there was one in the missing that didn't go through. So somewhere in that time it was turned off. Now, if you, or it didn't work. Now, this is interesting because plane took off at 12:41. At 1:20, which would be in this time period, this is when this is when the transponder went dark and, the plane was kind of lost, right?
Right.
So very interesting, right? That that there was no ping received at that time until, if I have this
207.
right, 3 minutes after the plane left the radar range of the military base. So again, transponder turned off, plane turns around, it's on radar at the military base. When it's lost from radar at the military base, they put that at about 2:25 a.m. There was a logon message received, almost as if this device was turned back on. Right? Now, that wasn't in the documentary. This is in a separate thing I read about Inmarsat and what this information was able to, or what all this information means. Now, so what Inmarsat said was, we have these pings. We don't have locational information in the pings, but we think we can, through mathematical equation, determine how long it took for the signal to go from our satellite to the plane and bounce back. And by that, we can determine how far the plane was away from the satellite. And we know the last reported position of the plane. So we know that it's in this kind of circle. It either went north, it would have had to have gone north, or directly south from this point for these distances to be accurate.
Correct.
And then at some point, and I'm not really clear, Mark, I don't know if you caught this, or maybe they just didn't say it, how they eventually determined, I don't know if it was through more refined calculations or more specific mathematical equations, but how did they actually determine, okay, we're sure the plane didn't go north, it went south towards the Indian Ocean?
Well, one of the reasons that they were confident that it didn't go north, I'm forgetting, what's it? I think Uzbekistan?
Yeah, it was Kazakhstan.
Kazakhstan, sorry.
Tajikistan?
One of the stands.
Yeah.
But in other words, based on that, and you laid it out very well, Bill, about with the mathematical calculations of the time the signal from the satellite to the plane or vice versa, that they knew it had to be within a certain radius, from the last known location. So if it had gone north, it would have run out of fuel. There's no way it could have passed a certain location, and it would have had to crash on land.
Mm.
And so, because that would be a lot easier to identify a debris field on land than that in the ocean, they knew, supposedly, we all know that it could not have possibly crashed on land. It would have been located and identified rather quickly. So the only other logical conclusion, it had to go just as far in the opposite direction, which would have put it in the southern Indian Ocean.
Yeah. And then I got from the Inmarsat data, the final transmission was at 8:19 in the morning, and that was a logon message. So what they think was the 8:19 message was a logon because the plane had run out of fuel, and I guess the all systems shut down, and then a backup, what were they saying? Auxiliary power unit would have started, not to fly the plane, but to run the electronics, or not to
Mhm.
fuel the engines, I should say, but just to run the electronics. And then that caused it to kind of reboot and log up again, or sync up again. And then there was no response at 9:15 when the next ping would have come. So at that point, they
Mhm.
kind of determined that the plane was no longer in the air. It's weird how, you know, I don't know what to make. So a couple things on this, just my general thoughts, Mark. First off is, I have heard incidents of ghost planes before, right? Where the cabin depressurizes and people are rendered unconscious and the plane just flies. Remember Greg Norman, the pro golfer?
Yes.
You remember that
Yes.
story? Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So that
Yeah.
was,
Horrible story.
yeah, horrible story, but kind of the same
Mhm.
scenario. Ghost plane, the cabin depressurized. Now, I know that was a private jet, so I don't know whether there's no overhead oxygen masks in those things. I don't know the deal, but the plane just flew until it ran out of fuel. And the other thing that I thought was interesting about this, and I bring that up only because, there's been issues with Boeing, cabin depressurization, and I don't know, it's something I definitely thought about there. The thing
Yeah.
that's Go ahead.
No, no. You're going to ask a question. Go ahead.
No, no, do you think there's anything to the cabin depressurization, or it's just because of the changing route of the plane that doesn't really, it's hard
Now,
to just, yeah.
in other words, I don't see any correlation or I don't see anything pointing to the cabin pressure, oxygen levels, things like this,
Mhm.
because we know from the documentary, not from my previous knowledge, but like everybody else watching the documentary, that pilots have a separate oxygen system that is more robust than that for the main cabin for the passengers. Obviously, if the pilots are not viable, no one's going to survive a flight. So they have to have a more robust, reliable, and a longer supply of oxygen than the passengers. So for all of these systems to fail simultaneously, I mean, catastrophically, in that regard, as far as the oxygen, it's really kind of beyond acceptable logic as far as I'm concerned. And then when you combine that with the communications, the transponder, things like this, in other words, that doesn't strike me as a possibility at all that this was just some type of a lack of oxygen issue.
Okay. Yeah, yeah. I can't argue with that. And the only other thing I'll say about the Inmarsat, and again, if I don't have this right, because this gets a little weird, and sometimes they drop these little tidbits in the thing, in the documentary. It's my understanding that the Inmarsat equipment could not be turned off from the cockpit. You actually had to go down into the belly of the electronics compartment. So you'd have
Mhm.
to leave the cockpit, walk back to the area in front of first class, pull up the carpet, lift up a hatch that's not locked, go down a ladder, and that's where the equipment would be for the Inmarsat system, where the power to it was. Now, I thought that was
Mhm.
interesting because if the report is accurate that it was turned off and then turned back on, then I started thinking, man, was there some kind of fire on the plane, caused by lithium batteries being transported or something like that? Was there some kind of catastrophic fire and they turned the plane around to try to head back to Malaysia? And, somehow things just went downhill, got out of control. And, who knows? I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. So the first theory, Mark, let's call it the pilot, right? That's the first theory they put forward, and I don't know, man. The way they put here's how the documentary put this theory forward. The pilot kind of tells the co-pilot to go get him a coffee or something like that and locks him out of the cockpit, turns everything off in that gray zone that you and I talked about, cuts off the oxygen to the cabin, and then it's just more or less a suicide flight, flying the plane till it runs out of fuel.
Mm-hmm.
Is it reasonable to think that, because here's the thing, when you, I don't know, I don't know what, so I'm thinking about cell phones, right? So when you're, obviously, if you're in the middle of the South Indian Ocean, there's not going to be any cell service anyway. When you're flying over the Malaysian Peninsula at 35,000 feet, yeah, probably no cell phone service either. So I get that. But wouldn't there be some kind of panic in the cabin or something if all of a sudden the co-pilot can't get back in? And, I just don't know. I mean, you would think there would be some kind of, especially in a post 9/11 time. Did that theory make sense where the co-pilot's just locked out and the captain's doing all these things and
Well, it didn't to me. It didn't make sense. Now again, these are all from. In other words, we all want to know the answer. We all want to know what happened to Amelia Earhart, right? We're all curious about these things, so we want an explanation. It's human nature. We want to know what happened, and so. Is this an easy theory? Yeah, it's an easy theory. It was a suicide. He locked the co-pilot out, and then he flew the plane, by the way, for how many hours? I don't know, 7 hours, 8 hours, whatever it was, until the plane was out of fuel, when he could have just ditched it, so to speak. He could have just crashed it intentionally, which happened. I believe it was an Egyptian airline 20 years ago or something like that, where a pilot committed suicide, took the whole plane down. He did it rather quickly. So we look at this explanation. Could that have happened? The answer is we don't know. Do I believe that it happened? I believe that it did not happen. One of the reasons is when you do an investigation, sometimes it does come down to eliminating all other possibilities. We don't know. We don't have evidence that this happened, but we have indisputable evidence that this did not happen, this did not happen, this did not happen, and this did not happen. And so it only leaves you with, one or two alternative theories or possibilities. That's really important when it comes to physical evidence. It's very important. And by the way, you talk about men and women who investigate airline crashes or, marine, whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. Often their conclusions are based on eliminating everything else through physical evidence, through hard physical evidence. So it comes down to a process of elimination. That doesn't work so well when you're talking about human nature. Well, just because we know it wasn't this, just because we can prove this, just because we can prove that, what that means is that this pilot committed suicide. That doesn't work. The other part of it is that when you go back and look at this profile, like that previous one I was talking about, and again, it may not have been Egyptian, so I can't remember who it was, but this guy actually was recorded, in other words, on the voice recorder, things like this. We know for a fact that he had intended to take the plane down. There is nothing in this pilot, talking about MH370, there's nothing in this pilot's history, witness information, nothing except for the one piece of, quote unquote evidence we can get to when it comes to the simulator. But outside of that, there's nothing to indicate this person had any financial, personal, psychological, emotional, political, any motivations or problems that would lead him to do such a thing. So right. I say that didn't happen.
Okay. That's interesting. So I probably should ask you this after we kind of ended on the Inmarsat. Your opinion of the Inmarsat data.
The Inmarsat data I find very compelling. I'll tell you what I find compelling about it. We talked about the lady who found the debris, who was the photographer, who has a great eye for this. I didn't find her credible. Not that I think she was lying to us. I just didn't find her in a credentialed way and in the way she presented the evidence or any substantiating evidence from unrelated sources to confirm what she brought to the table. The Inmarsat representative, I found him incredibly credible. He was clear, he was consistent, he was unshakable. I believed that guy, and sometimes he seems to come down to credibility and belief. I thought he was very, very credible.
So I too put a lot of faith in the Inmarsat data. And here's why I put my faith there. Not so much because you bring up good points about the person who represented the company in this documentary. Not so much for me because of him, but for me it was because the data had never been used in this manner before. So it would have
Excellent point, Bill.
Yeah, it would be
It's,
very
by the
hard.
way,
Right. It'd be
yeah,
very
go ahead.
hard for someone to say, okay, they're going to use this data, so we need to fabricate it, falsify it, or whatever. It's basically the company got its brain trust together and said, hey, is there any way to help out on this? And this was the first time, apparently, that they'd ever used the data in such a way to track a plane. Now, the other side of that, and I don't want to get ahead, so I don't know if this is the time to say this, but I will say that the flight simulation computer that was taken from the pilot's home, it was taken about a week after. I thought the date was the 15th. For some reason, I'm thinking the 15th. And I actually, again, Mark, I had to go look that up separately because they didn't say the date in the documentary. I think the flight simulator was seized from the pilot's home on the 15th. So big government did have that. So arguably, one could have impacted the other. In other words, they could have found something on the flight simulator computer and passed that to Inmarsat, or Inmarsat could have found their data and passed that to, if there was government corruption or if this was a nefarious plot, that's the timing of that thing. So I did think that's a little strange, but no, I found the Inmarsat data to be very credible and really.
And to your point, Bill, and I'm so glad you brought that up, because when I watched the documentary right there, at that time, I felt the same way about this data never being used before for these purposes. And my point was about that representative, is he made that point very clear. He goes, are you kidding me? This has never been used before like this. How would we cobble together such a story? It's never been done before. So he made that point right there,
Right.
In the documentary.
Right. So yeah, so not to say it again, but I did think that compelling, very compelling data as to where this plane likely ended its flight. The second theory then put forth in this documentary, and this gets into, I guess, episode 2, Mark, is the hijacking, right?
Yeah.
Now, what's interesting is, what would that be? About 4 months after this plane went down, Malaysian airline Flight 17 was shot down by the Russian government over Ukraine. And they made it a point to bring this up in the documentary, Mark, and I'm not really sure why. I guess because of the Crimea thing, or is that?
Yeah. The invasion in Crimea.
Right.
It was a little bit loose in its relevance to relationship and exactly the factual basis, but yeah.
Yeah, the only thing, a couple points about them bringing that other plane that was shot down over Ukraine in, I did say, wow, there's now an abundance of Malaysian Airlines 777 debris that's out there that the Ukrainian government or somebody has. You know what I mean? So, so when you see debris showing up later, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and people say, hey, this is the only place this debris could have come from this plane. Well, there was another almost identical airliner that was shot down by Russia over the Ukraine that created a tremendous amount of debris. And I just put that out there as something I thought was interesting. I think the kind of premise of this hijacking scenario, the way I took it, Mark, is as follows. Russia had just invaded Crimea. They wanted to divert the news media attention away from this invasion. So they put 3 operatives on the plane, and it was very interesting how they referred to them. They referred to them as 3 ethnic Russians.
Yes.
I'm not sure exactly what that means, but I'll use that term because they used it in the documentary. And the thought was that potentially they could have been hijackers. One of them creates a disturbance toward the rear of the plane. The second one accesses the electronics bay that I talked about that apparently isn't locked. And I mean, the aviation experts confirmed that, which is a little bit crazy, right?
Yeah.
They pull the carpet up kind of right by first class. There's a door. You lift the door up, you go down. And they say, now, originally, the guy that put forth this theory, Jeff Wise, I think was his name, and he was really heavily involved in this. What was a little disappointing in this is he had this whole theory. They go down there, they turn everything off. They showed them kind of plugging a laptop in. They take over control of the plane, and they're flying the plane from the avionics bay or whatever it's called. And then, some other expert says, yeah, but you can't fly the plane from the avionics bay or from the electrical cabinet. And he kind of says, oh yeah, I know you can't. There's definitely some problems with this theory. So it's like, how
big problems.
Yeah, how credible is a theory that factually can't be done? You cannot fly the plane
Correct.
from the. Go ahead, Mark.
Well, and sorry for getting in front of it, but because he said earlier on, or someone did, that they said, and blah blah blah, and they'll fly the plane from the electronics bay. That was actually said, and was later on that was debunked. And I thought, I lost all interest or belief in that possibility once they said that. It's like, first of all, I don't know a whole lot about planes, but there's enough there. I'm thinking you can fly the plane from this communications or electronics bay with a laptop. I've never heard such a thing.
Right.
And so later on in the documentary, not too much later, so well, and you can't fly it from a laptop, from this location. I go, oh, well, why do we even go down this road? So I'm totally on board with you with that. Not to mention, here's the other thing about this. I guess we have to assume, unless there's some other method of survival that we're not aware of, Bill, we have to assume that all three of these guys were martyrs and went down the plane.
Right. But it wouldn't be the first time. You know what I mean?
It would not be the first time.
Right.
It would not be the first time.
But yeah, I mean, I agree with you. When I saw that it was not technically possible to do this. And I want to say that guy, Jeff Wise, even acknowledged that later, and he's like, well, I'm just kind of putting these things out there. And then, everybody that had a theory, or I should say everybody, he had written a book. And, he was doing book publicity, and some of the other people he was originally in this group called The Independents, the Facebook group, and they kind of booted him out of it because he was kind of putting forth these theories that they felt were not factually based, and, et cetera, et cetera. Trying to think if there's anything else on that. No. So basically, two questions, Mark. And I think you already answered the first one. With respect to the hijacking scenario shown in the documentary, no go. At least that's my thought. But
I agree.
Is there a hijacking a hijacking theory, or do you feel that there's some credible evidence to show that this could have been a hijacking?
Well, I don't know if there's any credible evidence to show that there was a hijacking, unless you consider that I'm kind of stumbling on myself here. We don't have any evidence of any particular person or persons engaged in a hijacking here. I mean, that's about as clear as I can put it. I simply don't know. Is it as viable a theory as certainly anything that's been proposed? Absolutely. But in other words, it comes without any physical evidence whatsoever. Any physical or forensic evidence whatsoever.
Yeah, so I agree with that. And by the way, I don't think it was a hijacking. From what I've seen in this, I don't. That doesn't mean it wasn't, but I don't think it was.
And you said it better than I did. Yeah. In other words, is it possible? In other words, if there's evidence that pops up tomorrow, then we have to accept it. But I just don't see anything that indicates to me that it was a hijacking.
Right. There's one more theory, Mark, but before we get to it, I think it's important to probably talk about two pieces. The other two pieces of evidence that I think are really significant and form the basis of what you or I believe happened here. Lane Gibson, the self-proclaimed Indiana Jones, right? So this guy, world traveler, big fedora hat, Now, not him, and to be clear, someone else found off the coast, no, on Reunion Island, right? Which I guess is a
Yes.
French colony,
Oh,
French island, French territory, something like that.
yes.
Off the, what would that be?
Indian Ocean.
East coast of Africa in the Indian Ocean. Yep.
Uh-huh.
Found what they are calling a flaperon, a piece
Mhm.
of an aircraft. And I think they have established that this piece of an aircraft came from a 777, a rather large piece, right, Mark?
Yes. Yeah, it was.
A good sized piece, maybe like, I don't know, maybe almost the size of a hood of a car, something like that. Maybe not quite that
Yeah.
big, but at least the door of a, full size car. So this guy, this self-proclaimed Indiana Jones, Lane Gibson, he hears about this. He says he speaks to oceanographers and
Mhm.
asks them, if I wanted to find more, this wreckage washed up here, if I wanted to find more wreckage, where would I go? And they look at the kind of estimated spot, based on Inmarsat and fuel consumption and whatever, where this plane would have went down. And according to him, oceanographers tell him where to go. He goes there, and how quickly, Mark, did he find a piece of the plane?
It was, I mean, I think he found it at the airport when he landed. It was pretty quick. I mean, he went out. I honestly I want to say it was like on day 2, if I
Yeah.
remember correctly, something like that. He found a piece
Hey, I almost feel
of
like, yeah, I almost feel like it was quicker than that. I want to say
might have been.
one person said 2 hours and one person said 20 minutes.
Oh, you know what? I got the 2, and that's probably what is in my mind. It probably was 2 hours. Yeah.
but here's what he did. He went to like the local village where this guy told where the oceanographers told him to go. And right now
Mhm.
we're talking a city on the coast of Mozambique, I think. I don't remember what the name of the city was, but regardless, he goes there and he speaks to the locals, and they say, they messed me up with this a little because they had a name for this that I'd never heard. But what they were talking about, you're familiar with this from Florida, I'm sure, now that you're a captain, a registered vessel captain. They said there was a sandbar, then they used some other word, where they said where the fishermen go to get their nets and buoys and everything. And
Yeah.
the way they explained that was not the best. They should have said when fishermen lose their equipment at sea,
Right.
this is where it washes up.
I
Because
agree.
it took me a couple times watching it. I was like, what the F are they talking about? And then I realized, oh, this is a sandbar where everything washes up, which is a
Yeah.
logical place that you would go.
Mhm.
And he went there, and within 20 minutes or so, a couple hours, anywhere with 20 minutes, a couple hours, he found
Mhm.
a triangular piece of what appeared to be aircraft, right? And it even had no step written on it. Yeah. So, within, he immediately finds a piece of this plane. Now, a Frenchman who, I probably shouldn't refer to him this way, but I refer to him throughout this documentary as the angry Frenchman. He says, he basically, he doesn't find Lane Gibson credible. Some of the
Right.
other survivor families find Lane Gibson very credible. They are happy that he's doing what he's doing. This particular gentleman did not. And he said, let me understand this. This guy, kind of like what you said, this guy gets off the plane at the airport. In 20 minutes, he's on a deserted beach. He finds a piece of a plane, and there happens to be all the English speaking media there with him to photograph it and document it. And yes, when you put it that way, if that is what actually happened, that's a little skeptical. So he went on to go to then Madagascar, and he's traveling, the east coast of Africa, finding wreckage of this plane all over the place.
Mhm.
The only thing I'll add before asking you your thoughts on him, Mark, is they did connect him to Russia. So he's a fluent Russian speaker, and he, at one point in time, not, I think it was in the 90s, started a business with 2 other Russian gentlemen. And we just spoke about Russia shooting down another Boeing 777 over Ukraine. So it would be almost an identical aircraft to the one that's missing. Knowing that, and having one camp of people that thinks he's credible and he's finding parts of the missing aircraft, another camp that thinks he's possibly a Russian spy or American spy or whatever, and it sounds like the intimation is that he's planting pieces of the aircraft or whatever. What are your thoughts on this guy and the wreckage that's recovered off the east coast of Africa?
So the first thing is I find it hard to believe. And again, I don't have I don't have any more way of knowing what the truth is than anybody else, but I do find it very, very suspicious that I think it was about a year and a half or so, give or take, after the flight went missing, that the first piece is found. And then he's able to find the next 27 or whatever pieces, in multiple locations. I know that some of these countries, some of these islands he went to are underdeveloped. They're not, New York City or Los Angeles, media icons, things like this. But this incident was known throughout the world. I find it really, really hard to believe that no one else found a piece of the wreckage in the same locations that he found them and didn't bring that forward to the authorities. It's really difficult to understand how that's possible. The part about the Russian connection, I don't know. I don't know. We've heard this a lot going back to Lee Harvey Oswald, that he was a Russian stooge, and he was the person that killed JFK because of the Russians, things like this. I don't know, but I do find this particular case here, it's very, very hard to believe. It's a possible, yes, but it's hard to believe that he pretty much alone found virtually all the pieces of this plane that we have today. It's really bizarre. As a matter of fact, Bill, it's so bizarre, you would think that anybody engaged in a conspiracy wouldn't go this far.
Mm.
In other words, because it looks too shabby.
Right.
That you'd find 2 or 3 pieces and you call it quits right there, because that would be enough to indicate where the. So it's a very, very bizarre thing. No matter which way you look at it, it's like, how could the Russian government or whatever, players in a possible conspiracy, how could they be this inept to engage in such over the top behavior? I don't have the answer to it. All I can say is that there are a lot of questions here. Like you said, you had, ready-made media, English-speaking media with them and things like this. It's very, very tempting to say that, oh, this guy was involved in a conspiracy. It kind of looks like that to me.
Right.
But at the same time, having been a trained investigator and somebody who's supposed to just look at the evidence, I can't take it to that next level where I said, yep, there's no doubt about it. Because the only evidence I have, as damning as it is, it's not concrete.
Yeah. So a couple things that I thought of and I jotted down here while you were talking about this. This is a crazy story, Mark, that happened to me. And it goes to sometimes just taking a shot, right? In other words, he talked to an oceanographer who said, go here. It's pretty damn suspicious that he just went to this place and found a piece of a plane within 20 minutes. I'm going to tell you a story about something that happened to me in 1996, right? At that time, a big investigative tool was, remember we all had pagers back then, Mark?
Yes.
Some listeners may not even know what that is, but we all had pagers back then. And we, as an investigative tool, we would get court-ordered intercepts of these pagers. So we would have a little dot matrix printer in the office, and whenever this suspect got a message on his pager, a phone number or whatever, it would come across our dot matrix printer. So I remember 1996 driving home from the office once, and my partner calls me, and and also at that time, the way people would use pagers is they would have generally a numeric code to identify who they were, right? So you wouldn't just get a phone number, you would get a phone number and then a code. So you would have an idea in your head, oh, this is so-and-so paging me. Let me go to a phone and call him. So I'm driving home on the 105 freeway westbound, and I get a call from the office, and my partner gives me this number, and he says, hey, this is weird. This number just came across our pager intercept, and it's the code number from this guy who's a suspect on this case, but usually he's in Miami. So, and it's a 310 number. And I said, what's the number? And he gave me the number. And Mark, it's a true story. I swear, on anyone's life who is significant to me. I said, you know, if he's from Miami and he's coming out to LA, he would be going to LAX. He would be flying into LAX. Maybe that's a payphone at the airport. I'm on the 105 freeway. Let me just jump off the 105 freeway at LAX and let me see what's going on over here. Now, that's the most asinine thing to do, but I was probably 29 years old at the time, you know, didn't really know better that this was a needle in a haystack, right? So pull off the 105 freeway. I go to LAX. I think, okay, flying from Miami to LA at that time, the criminal element, Mark, used to fly an airline called Carnival Air. Big flights from LA to Miami, back and forth. And they flew out of the Bradley terminal, which is the international terminal. So I park, walk into the Bradley terminal, Mark, walk up to a bank of payphones, which, by the way, there's no more payphones at airports. We all know that. I pick up the receiver on the first one, look at it. No, that's not the number. I pick up the receiver on the second payphone, Mark, and look at it, and that's the phone number that came across the text intercept, right? And I call my partner and I say, "You're not going to believe this, but I found this payphone. You know, I'm calling you from it right now." And I look around and there's a group of people. You know, this particular case was Colombian, Cuban traffickers, like basically picking up cocaine in LA, driving it to New York, and, you know, probably, in fact, we had help from CHP on this specific case that this turned into. Anyway, see some suspicious people. They get on a hotel bus. I drive to that hotel. We end up tracking them down. And the next day, eastbound, or what is that, northbound 15? Northbound 15.
Yep. Northbound 15, heading to Vegas.
Northbound 15, out in the middle of nowhere, do a stop, and they have 200 kilos on a tour bus. So the point is that sometimes, hey, you know, crazier things have happened, is all I'm saying, than, you know, is it plausible? Not really, but sometimes crazy things happen. Now, did I have English speaking media with me at the airport to document this thing? No, I did not. So the only thing else I'll say about Gibson is, it's possible that he is not part of a conspiracy, Mark, but it's possible it's just self-promotion, right? He's not part of any Russian conspiracy. He's just trying to make himself out to be the international Indiana Jones, mystery solver, etc. And I think that's more than likely. And for him, I really had to discount some, like the evidence that he recovered, I kind of had to discount, right? Had to kind of ignore it. And one other thing about the wreckage, and then we'll move on to the final theory and wrap this up. One other thing about the wreckage, the flaperon that was found, the biggest piece of the plane, not found by Gibson. And Mark, you'll know this from CHP days. Now, I guess there's like almost like a VIN on this. Yeah. There should have been a identification number riveted to this part of the plane. And what happened when they examined it? It was missing.
Gone.
It was gone.
Yeah.
And when is that piece, when is that identification number removed? When a plane is salvaged and it's cut up. So, and again, is that possible that it fell off or something, or if it was never put on at Boeing? Yeah, anything's possible. But man, that's so hard to overcome when, and they were very quick to say, but there were other numbers, you know, one out of the other 12 numbers that were stamped or something, like lot numbers of parts matched. But I didn't hear a justification as to why this VIN plate, let's call it, or whatever you want to call it, why it was missing.
Yeah, that was a big part, a significant part of this, about that one being missing. I believe they alluded to the unlikelihood that this identification plate would have separated, you know, in a catastrophic event, that it's designed to survive the catastrophic events. And so, you know, a theory that, well, it got blown off or broken off, things like this is very, very unlikely. That was a very telling, that was a very significant part of this. The other side of that coin, though, Bill, is, and this is why it's so difficult. This is why, you know, people pretend, oh, I know what happened over me. And really, I don't think anybody knows. But if an entity is going to go through the tremendous work involved to facilitate such a conspiracy, they wouldn't miss that detail.
Right.
They would not leave the identification numbers and all those other parts, knowing that people are going, hey, this is MH370, and then have that huge part, the place, the ribbon there where they know that it goes and leave it off. That's my belief that people are going to this extent. They're going to be more detailed in that. Could I be wrong? Could they be sloppy? Of course. But there's two sides to that coin, and this is what makes it so intriguing.
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't really looked at it in that way, and which does then kind of point to the self-promotion part. Are people finding wreckage in an effort, in an effort to promote themselves or whatever, as opposed to a conspiracy or international espionage plan or whatever. The final theory put forth, the intercept, or no, you know what? The flight simulator stuff, real quick. So
Yeah, real quick on that one.
yeah, so a week after the plane goes missing, Malaysian authorities search the pilot's home, Zakari
Yeah, I
Khan,
believe that's the name. Yeah.
and he has, which is not uncommon, he has a pretty elaborate flight simulator. They take it, the FBI analyzes it, and 2 years later, now, okay, so 2 years later, I think it comes out reported by, I don't know who initially reported it. In fact, Mark, I don't remember, but it comes out a couple years later that there was a simulated flight similar to the route that this plane took. In other words, taking off from KLA to Beijing, turning back over the Malaysian peninsula, going to some waypoint on the other side of Malaysia, and then turning and heading due south. Some issue with that in that they said, no, this actually, it wasn't necessarily flown, like he didn't sit in the simulator and fly that whole route. It was just points that were plotted, or he moved the cursor and dropped a point. Now, I almost feel like that's, if, so first of all, I have chosen to put faith in that evidence. I do believe that evidence. And when we give our theories at the end, I'll kind of explain why. I'm not surprised that the FBI has still not commented on this because, again, they did the analysis and they passed the information to Malaysia. I don't think it's not law enforcement's place to comment on an investigation that they're assisting in or to just go public with information like that. Your thoughts on the flight simulator stuff, where does that evidence sit with you?
So with the flight simulator data, I wanted to be very careful on that one because for some reason I felt that we did not get the entire story of the flight simulator. In other words, what we don't know is this, that they said that he did, first of all, he didn't fly it, right? It was just it was the point of reference. He drugged the mouse there, he clicked on it. What we were not told, and again, I don't know if why they did this, but I'm wondering, were there other points of reference that he clicked on with the mouse? In other words, were 10, 30, 400 points? He said, if we found that out tomorrow, you and I would completely disregard the point of reference that he clicked on as far as the South Indian Ocean.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who uses a simulator, he was on it all the time. He was giving like instructional stuff or just informational stuff he did on his YouTube channel. My guess is that there are countless points of reference where he clicked on that simulator, but they pulled this out for purposes of the documentary because it's so salacious.
Mm-hmm.
That's my thought.
Interesting.
I don't know that. I don't know what I don't know, but I did kind of analyze that. Man, like you, Bill, I said, this is really compelling. What are the odds that he actually clicked on the general area where most of us believe that the plane went down?
Yeah.
And then I thought, wait a minute. How do I know he didn't click on the Antarctic? He didn't click on, whatever, you name it. We don't know.
Right. And, when we'll leave that piece at that. And then when I tell you what I think, I'll give you a little more detailed explanation of what I think with that data. The intercept theory. Okay. For me, so I guess there were war games going on in this area at this time. And the theory is that two American AWACS planes, start where I should start. This flight, the theory is that this flight was shot down, forced down by United States because it was carrying protected technology from Kuala Lumpur to China. And their justification for identifying this, quote, protected technology was there was a shipment on board this airplane that was described as walkie-talkies and lithium batteries, if I'm not mistaken. And they said it
Correct.
was delivered under escort and it wasn't X-rayed. To me, having somewhat knowledge of LAX, everything's delivered under escort. I mean, you're not going to
Yeah.
deliver. That means nothing, And
Yeah.
the only thing I did think that was weird, I said, wow, here's kind of walkie-talkie. Generally, I would think of electronics like this being manufactured in China, not being manufactured elsewhere and imported into China. That's the only thing that I thought was a little strange. But to be honest, I mean, there's no indication whatsoever that was any type of protected technology. And the theory is that the United States learned about it at the last moment, had these AWACS planes in the air, jammed MH370. So, the transponder stopped working. They couldn't communicate and like tried to force the plane to turn around, or the plane did turn around and start heading back to Malaysia, but the pilot wouldn't land or whatever. And the plane was either shot down with a missile or that another plane collided with it, and wreckage, who knows where it is. Your thoughts on that third theory called the intercept theory, Mark?
Yeah, it's too much going on.
Too much.
Yeah, there's just too much going on. And like you said, the whole premise of it is so weak about the transporting of, someone told me, oh yeah, there's a tactical nuclear weapons missing, and we have reason to believe that it was actually on, MH370. I mean, that might make more sense here, but lithium batteries and walkie-talkies it just doesn't make any sense to me. This one's the most far-fetched of all the three possibilities.
Agreed. Mark, let's wrap this up. It's been 10 plus years. Here's what I think based on the Inmarsat data. I believe in the Inmarsat data. I believe in the flight simulator data. I probably put more faith in that from you than from what I hear. What I think about the flight simulator data is, and again, we don't know what we don't know, but does it make sense that he would drop a point there? Yeah, it would if he was estimating if the captain was estimating where fuel would run out. That's why I put so much faith in that. I feel like this event that happened, the missing plane, I feel like the captain of the plane was responsible for it. Don't know if it goes to his mental state. I don't know the reasons why, but I do feel like I never was able to overcome that initial turning off of the transponders and the not checking in with the Ho Chi Minh air traffic control when he was in that gray zone, changing the course of the plane at least twice. And why, the question that I have heard a bunch is, well, then, if it's a suicide mission, why fly it for 8 hours? Well, first of all, once that course is established, that southbound course, we don't know that he was alive for 8 hours. We don't know if the co-pilot was alive, really, after takeoff from Malaysia. He may have chosen that area because it's one of the most remote places on the face of the earth, in one of the most challenging environments on the face of the earth. And Mark, one thing I heard you mention earlier is about a black box, right? And voice recordings of the cockpit. We don't have any of that.
No.
And maybe, this is a very knowledgeable captain. Maybe that was part of the choice to ditch the plane in that remote area, was to prevent recovery of something that would actually solve the mystery or implicate him or shed further light on what happened. So again, the only scenario that makes sense in my mind is that the captain actively diverted the plane. That's why it didn't arrive in Beijing. And that plane lies in the South Indian Ocean at the bottom somewhere as a result of the captain's behavior. Your thoughts?
So my thoughts are this: when I talked about and I think that there was probably a lack of revealing the totality of the flight simulator information. I I'm pretty confident that there are other points on there that he clicked on that had nothing to do with where this plane most likely did end up. But I said that for a reason to try to remain objective about this. Like, listen, we have to be very careful about evidence and look at the totality of the situation. and ask questions about what may be missing. Having said all that, Bill, I agree with you in the sense that if I had to lean towards one explanation, it would be human induced cause of the disappearance of this plane. I still don't have any direct evidence other than the simulator, which I still think is sketchy, but I still think it's reasonable evidence that this pilot committed suicide and killed, 200 and basically 40 other people on that plane. It's the only one that is reasonable to me. It's the only reasonable explanation that this had to be human induced because of the redundancy, because of the safeguards, and because of all of the communications and tracking devices and systems that are available to every commercial airliner, internally and externally. The only thing that I would bet money on, so to speak, of the three possible ones is the suicide.
Mhm.
Again, I'm not convinced it happened, but it's by far the most likely, in my opinion.
Agreed. Agreed. Ladies and gentlemen, give us your thoughts in the comments. There's probably infinite scenarios out there. Let us know what you think. If there's something we missed, and we'll take a look at it. And thanks everyone for joining us.